Good Thursday morning to you. As we continue focusing on David this week, I want to focus on the specifics of David during his time with Bathsheba. So to catch you up, yesterday we talked about Saul. We talked about the relationship between David and Saul and just how tumultuous it was because of Saul's jealousy. Saul ends up falling by the sword, and Jonathan also dies at the war at the end of the conflict. Word gets back to David that Saul has died. David laments his death. His people, his men, lament the death of Saul, God's anointed, because, again, David has this beautiful faithfulness to honor what God is doing despite what Saul was doing or despite how he might have wanted to respond to Saul's actions. And there's some time that goes past, and David is finally anointed as king. David is 30 years old when he's anointed as king. He will serve for 40 years. This is a wonderful kingship and one of the longer ones in the history of the Israelites and God's people. David does extraordinary things. First of all, he settles his home in Hebron initially. He is able to merge the northern kingdom with the southern kingdom. They had been divided during Saul's reign. This was a big step in united Israel back to what God intended them to be as they lived in the promised land. Then David establishes his city as Jerusalem. Now, if you are a Bible nerd and you love the story of the gospel narrative, you will know that actually it is Bethlehem that we call the city of David that will come later. Initially, David's city, his headquarters, his capital, is set up as Jerusalem. That's going to be important to later, by the way. So he sets up the kind of the headquarters of religion and of politics in Jerusalem. Make sure you remember that, by the way. David sets up the headquarters of religion and politics in Jerusalem, and then he establishes his kingdom. So David has done amazing things so far. We're in 2 Samuel, and as he's doing all of these amazing things, he also brings the Ark of the Covenant back into the people. At first, he doesn't want the Ark to be in his home. He wants it to be near him, but not too close to him. Obed-Edom is the man who takes in the Ark of the Covenant. His family is blessed. David sees how amazing that is, so then David brings the ark into his home, into his region, and then David wants to build a temple. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, we get into the story of why God does not allow the temple to be built. And if you read verses 11 through 14, Jesus Christ is all over that text. So that's kind of an aside. But today I want to talk about the occurrence with David and Bathsheba, because as we've been listening and thinking about David, he has this incredible faithfulness. He is able to see through the horrible things that Saul did, trying to take his life. He's able to see through and keep his focus on the Lord despite the circumstances. And now we have a moment where David's humanness is present. So if you know the story, we are in 2 Samuel chapter 11. By the way, I think the best version of the story exists in VeggieTales. If you have never watched VeggieTales, you have to watch VeggieTales: The Great Pie War. That is the VeggieTales version of this. It's so much easier to teach this story to children if you watch The Great Pie War. Instead of lusting after a woman who's bathing on the balcony, you have David lusting after a rubber ducky. So much easier to explain it to children. That's beside the point. So if you are left with confusion, if you don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of what's happening in chapter 11 of 2 Samuel, YouTube The Great Pie War or go to your library and check it out. You'll thank me for it. But as we know the story, Bathsheba is on her balcony bathing. It has been that time of the month. She is doing her purification bathing, and so she's preparing herself to be able to re-enter into her community. Again, women were ousted when it was that time of the month because of the blood, and so she is now preparing herself to be re-entered into her community. Instead of David being the normal king of going off to war, which he had done countless times beforehand, this just happens to be a season where he doesn't go off to war. He sends Joab to do that for him. That's his commander-in-chief. And so he is in the right place at the right time to see Bathsheba bathing. And he calls out to her. He sends a messenger, and Bathsheba comes into the kingdom, and he lies with her. Now, human biology reminds us that there are certain times of the month that you are almost guaranteed to produce a baby, and this would be one of them. And so he lies with Bathsheba. She conceives a child, and she sends word to David that she is pregnant. And there seems to be no remorse at this point until David realizes what has happened, and he tries to cover it up. That's not really remorse, but he realizes that he's done something bad. So he sends word to his commander, Joab, to have Uriah, that's Bathsheba's husband, come back. He hopes that Uriah will go and lay with his wife, as men do when they come back from their military service. Uriah has honor. He instead stays with his men, because if they are not in their homes, why should he be? The next day, David even tries to get him drunk so that he might wander off back to his wife. Uriah, again, a man of great character, does not go back to Bathsheba, does not go back to his wife. And so finally David knows that he has to cover up what he has done. And so he sends word to Joab to allow Uriah to advance to the front of the lines, which is most assuredly going to end Uriah's life. It does in the conflict. David even consoles Joab to think that this was an accident, that this wasn't intentional, and even makes it look like this was not calculated in any way. And so after Bathsheba has mourned the loss of her husband, she comes into the kingdom to live as David's wife. Now then we have Nathan. Nathan is the prophet of the time. He comes to David and he tells this parable. This is where the Veggie Tales episode is brilliant, because it has a flannel graph. If you've been part of the Lutheran church, or really any church, for a long enough time, you know the benefits of a flannel graph. He shows him and he tells him a metaphor, a story, to connect David with what has happened. He says, there's a rich man who has all these sheep, and there's a poor man with just one sheep. And the rich man goes and steals the poor man's sheep, and David is outraged. That rich man needs to be put to death. He has taken the one thing out of this poor man's life, more than just an animal, a pet, a loved part of the family. And Nathan reveals, you're the rich man in this story. Here's what I think is really important about this story. Is because as soon as God speaks through the prophet Nathan to David, as soon as he shows him what he should have seen all along, what he clouded his own vision to not see, David repents. He says in chapter 12, verse 13, I have sinned against the Lord. I admit it. I've done it wrong. I am horrible. I have sinned against the Lord. David's faith never waned. While his judgment may have been questionable, his faith in God never waned. And Nathan says, because of what you have done, the child will die. The Lord struck the child, and the child becomes very sick as it is born. And 7 days, David laments. David doesn't eat. He doesn't drink. He has his whole court worried about him. He will not sleep. All he does is pray and grieve the sickness of this child. In fact, it's so bad that the court doesn't even want to tell David when the child dies after 7 days. And David hears them whispering, and he says, my child has died. And they say, yes. And David washes himself. He puts on clothes. He takes off the ashes, and he sits at the table and he eats. And this confuses his court. And his court says, you were suffering so greatly while the child was sick. Why are you not still suffering after the child has died? And David's response is really beautiful. In chapter 12, verse 22, it says this. He said, when the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me, and the child may live. But now he is dead. Why shall I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me. See, even in this horrible occurrence of David losing his son with Bathsheba, even in his remorse, he does not kindle his anger against the Lord. He seeks mercy. He has hope in forgiveness and the possibility that God might relent and change his mind. But he honors his faith. And when the child has died, his faith continues in the God who loved him, who gave him life, who called him, who anointed him, and who has sustained him in every aspect of life. I don't know about you, but when things are really hard, when life is really a struggle, that is probably one of those times where I think, God, could you just take it a little easy? Could you just be with me a little bit more? That's probably the moment when I feel farthest away from God. And yet David reminds us that God's never far away from us, even in the circumstances we wish weren't happen, even in the circumstances that are a result of our own behavior. God sustains us and loves us and sees us through and carries us forward. So can you relate? Can you relate to a faith that really can endure anything? Because that's David. David is the king who has a faith that can endure anything this world has to give. And if that was true for David at that time, it is true for you and I as well. Have a great Thursday.